TypeScript is becoming an absolute must-have in modern Node projects. It significantly increases maintainability, reduces errors, and when combined with your IDE, provides an awesome developer experience with better autocomplete and IntelliSense suggestions. In this guide, we'll explore how to integrate TypeScript into a new or existing Node.js project, share some migration tips, and introduce some cool tools that allow us to run TypeScript without that compilation step for an easier development experience. So what I've done here is I've loaded up an example project that has one JavaScript file and it's utilizing Node and a couple of extra tools like Express. You can actually start this using a default Node project yourself or an existing Node project. I'll show you how we can migrate some JavaScript files over and also how to create some new TypeScript files. But you can also find this demo project on our GitHub, and I'll leave a link to that down in the description down below, as well as a blog post where you can follow along with some of our code changes. Some important things to note about this project though is, as I said earlier, we're using a couple of third-party libraries like Express, Axios, and Morgan, and it's actually currently using NodeMon, which if you haven't seen, essentially just refreshes the script every time we make changes to our code, because I'll be showing us later how we can get rid of this for a cool TypeScript tool that's going to do essentially the same thing, and it's going to help sort of clean up our development workflow. So we want to start using TypeScript in our Node project. Our first step is going to be to install that. So we come to our terminal here. We're going to install it using a package manager of your choice. So we're going to be using npm in my case. We're going to do -d here, so npm install -d, and that's going to make it a developer dependency. And we're just going to add TypeScript. Now, if we're doing a Node project like we are, you also want to install @types/node. And we'll look at this a bit later on with third-party libraries as well. Now, what @types/node is essentially the Node project doesn't have any TypeScript declarations by default. It doesn't include it in its own package to use all of their APIs. So what we do is we install an external one that's usually community maintained or maintained by the same team that makes the package. And that adds all of the type declarations that we need for this project so that we can start using it in TypeScript. Because if you don't install this @types/node, you may notice you get errors when you try and use something like console or fetch from the Node.js API. So let's go ahead and install that. Now we can verify that this is installed correctly by doing npx tsc and then -v. And you can see there that I've got TypeScript version 5.5.4 installed. Now this tsc command is the important command, as what we've done when we've installed TypeScript there is we've installed the TypeScript compiler. That's what tsc stands for. This is what's going to take our .ts files and make .js files out of them. It's going to compile them all to JavaScript. So now that we've got that, we need to configure TypeScript to tell it some things about our project and how it needs to interpret some of the TypeScript code. To do that, what we do is we create a tsconfig at the root level of your project, or you can come in here and do npx tsc --init. If you use the init, it's actually going to give you a couple of defaults for a TypeScript project. We don't actually want any of these defaults, as we're going to set this up for a Node project. But what you'll see is it does show you pretty much all of the options you can use, as well as comments for what they mean. We're actually going to go ahead and delete everything in the compiler options object here, like so. But don't worry, you can always check out what all of those options meant on the TypeScript documentation, and I'll leave that linked down below as well. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing a tsconfig ourselves that's been provided by the community, which is some recommended defaults for Node. So first, what you're going to want to do is find out what Node version your project is currently running, or that you're currently running. Just do node-v. And you'll see this number here. We want the major version. So I'm on node 20 here. Yours might be a little bit different, whether you're on node 21, node 22, but I'm on node 20 here. The next thing we'll do is we'll install a package. So we're going to do npm install. And then what we'll do is we're going to do -d again to make that developer dependency. And then you do @tsconfig and then /node and then the version of your choice. So again, in my case, it was node 20. So we go ahead and install that. Now you can actually see this community project on GitHub here. It says tsconfig/bases. So it just hosts all of the TypeScript configs tuned for a particular runtime environment. And you can see the ones that it's compatible with here. So you can go down this list here and you can see it has node 10 all the way up to node 22. I use this node 21. Another important thing to note as well is you don't actually have to install the package if you don't want to. You can go ahead and copy these compiler options here and paste them in your own tsconfig, but we're going to be using this extends option up here. So back in our code, now that we've got that package installed, we come up here above compiler options and we add extends. Generally a good idea to always leave extends at the top of this file, just so you can see whether it's related to another file and if it's building on top of another one. So here what we do is we do @tsconfig/node20, or again, whichever version you installed, and then tsconfig.json, like so. And then we add a comma at the end of that to make sure that's a valid JSON. But what we've done here is essentially say, use all of the options that this file define, and then the ones that we build on top of that as well. So we're going to be extending those options, because we need to come in here and define a couple of our own options now that are project specific. The first one is going to be the output directory, so outdir here. Now, it's generally a good idea to set this to something like dist or build. Essentially what this is, as I said earlier, we're going to have some .ts files in here, but they need to be compiled to JavaScript to be able to run on Node. So this is going to say where to put those compiled files. So in our case, it's going to put in a directory at this root level called dist when we actually run the compiler. The next thing that we want to do, and this is useful if you're migrating a project. If you're not migrating a project, you don't need this, but this is going to be called allow.js here. And we're going to set that to true. What this is saying is don't error out the compiler if you find a JavaScript file. So if we're migrating a project, obviously we're going to have loads of JavaScript in there. So we don't want it to cause an error if there is JavaScript files in there. As I said, if you're starting a new project, you should really always be using TypeScript files if you've got TypeScript set up. So you can actually get rid of that option, and we'll remove this later once we've migrated everything over to make sure that everyone on our team or in our project is always using TypeScript files. Now, outside of these compiler options here, what we can do is we add an include. In this include, we're going to define the folder where we're going to place all of our TypeScript. So for us, that's going to be source. And then we're going to use this pattern here of **/ like that. This is going to say all of our TypeScript is going to be in this source folder and any nested folders within that source folder as well. So it's going to pick up any TypeScript and any TypeScript we put in folders in this source directory here, as that's where all our code is going to go. The next thing that we want to do is add an exclude. And in this exclude, just exclude node_modules. This generally just clears up some errors sometimes that you may run into when third-party libraries have some type issues. This should pretty much remove all of them and just make sure that we're running the compiler on our code only. So now that we've got that set up, we have actually got TypeScript configured and ready to go. So let's go ahead and start using it. And then I'll show you some cool things for migrating JavaScript, as well as how we can start running this in a nice dev environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an example.ts file. Again, I'm doing that in my source folder, as that's where I've said all my code is going to go. I'm going to define a quick function in here called sayHello. That's going to be a name, and I'm just going to use some TypeScript here of string. This isn't really a TypeScript tutorial, but it's just how we get TypeScript set up for Node. So I'm going to assume that you know some TypeScript already or are starting to learn it. But as I'm saying there is I'm saying the argument for this function has to be a string. Let me just quickly add, let's say, a console.log here. And then I'll add in hello and then comma, and then I'll do add name here. Now the script, as I said, it's going to be super simple. I'll just do say hello, and then at the end of here, I'll say hello to world. Now, what you'll notice is now that we've got this thing, if I do node and then let's say source/example.ts, so if I go and try and run this in Node, it's going to error out as Node can't run TypeScript. It doesn't know what that file extension is. So that's where we need to run the compiler first. So to do that, you do npx tsc, and you don't need to add anything after that, as now we've got our tsconfig set up. It's going to go look in this include folder and start to compile any TypeScript we have in there. So now when we do npx tsc, you see it's reported no errors. If you had some errors in your TypeScript, it would report them, but then it will also compile to here. So you see we now have a script which is example.js, which has that JavaScript in it, but it's removed the type declarations from the file, as this now needs to be valid JavaScript that can be run. So now if you're running your files anywhere, you need to make sure you're running them out of the dist folder. So if I change this now to node dist, and then you also want to do example.js or whichever file you're running, and you'll see there it's now logging hello.world. So this is a good time to change any of your sort of package.json scripts if you have any, or if you're using NodeMon like me, it's a good time to change this to use the dist folder instead of any folder that you may have been using before if you're migrating a project. Now, the other thing I want to mention is if I come into my say hello here and I force a TypeScript error, say I do say hello 1, which is a number, not a string, what you'll notice is if I go ahead and compile this, and then we look at the compile code, while it has printed out an error there for me, it will actually go ahead and compile that code anyway. So as you see there, it has that say hello 1. You can modify this behavior. We won't be doing that in this tutorial, but just to show you how you could do it, you could do -- no omit on error. And essentially that will stop it compiling when there's an error in any of the TypeScript. And you can also add that as an option in your compiler options here by just doing comma and then no omit on error. Again, the same thing there. And you could change that to true. As I said, we won't be using this as we'll be adding a development tool later on that will essentially do the same thing, and our script won't run if there's an error anyways. So now let me go ahead and fix this error quickly. Let me change that back to world and go ahead and save that. And as you've seen, we're now running our code from that example.js. So you may also want to change some of your scripts in here. A good one and a common one is if you have something like build or run, you always want to run the TSC compiler in front of it first to make sure you're running the latest version of your code. And then you could change this to Node and then using our dist file there and making sure we're doing example.js, so that JavaScript extension there. So now if I do npm run build like so, you'll see it goes ahead, it compiles to the latest version and it changes that to Node and then it runs it for us. So if I change this to James and then I rerun that command, we should see that print out hello James there as it's compiling the latest version and then running it. Now what I'll show you is a couple of cool ways we can migrate some JavaScript projects and also how to fix some third-party library issues. So as I said here, we have a server.js file, and this is actually using Express, Morgan, and a few various other tools. Now, one of the first tools we have for actually migrating JavaScript is obviously we could just change the file extension here, and that would work for a project of this size with one JavaScript file in it, and then you just fix all of the errors in there. But say you've got a larger project, for example, you can come in your tsconfig and you can actually get it to type check your JavaScript as much as possible. So you set check.js to true in your compiler options, and we go ahead and save that. And now if I run the compiler by doing that npx tsc, what you'll notice is it's now found 6 errors, but these errors are coming from that server.js file. Now I know the code in there is actually good from type errors. The issue is coming from some third-party libraries. And you'll see here that the TSC compiler actually tells us that it can't find a declaration file for the module Express and the same one for Morgan. So you may see a couple of these pop up. As I explained with the Node project, essentially what this is the Express library itself doesn't have any type declarations in it. So you go ahead and you can install some ones provided by the community at Types project. So what we do down here is we just do npm install -d, again, saving these as a development dependency, at types, and then /express for me, and then at types /Morgan. Again, this may be a little bit different depending on what third-party libraries you're using, but that should fix any third-party library issues you run into. So once that's gone ahead and installed, if I run the compiler again, you see that we have no errors. Now, what I will say is if we now change this to a .ts, we're going to start to get some more TypeScript errors in our file. That's because while it is checking the JavaScript for type errors, it can't do a full check because if we're loading in data from an external API, for example, there's no way in JavaScript to define the structure of that data loaded in, but there is a way in TypeScript. So I'll show you that a bit later when we change this to .ts. But first, what I want to show you is a couple of options we have when we're incrementally updating a larger project. So as I showed you with check.js, this is going to check all of your JavaScript files. Now, the first way you can do is you can do a block list approach. So if you have a file that maybe you can't change the TypeScript in it, or you can't fix the type error yet, because maybe it relies on another file, but you still want to be able to run and push your code to production, you can do @ts-nocheck at the top of this file. So this ts-nocheck here is essentially just going to say to the TypeScript compiler, while you are checking all of our JavaScript files in our project, just go ahead and ignore this file, though you don't need to run any type checking on this. We can actually do this the other way around as well. We can change this to ts-check and get rid of check.js here. So what that will do is it will just ignore any type checking on all of your JavaScript files unless it has this ts-check declaration at the top. A couple of other cool comments that we have in TypeScript, you can do ts-ignore here. That's just going to ignore the next line from any type checking. So again, say you had a type error on this line, but none of the other file, and this line can only be fixed by fixing it in another file somewhere. You can do ts-ignore while you go ahead and fix that later on. Another really cool one, and in my opinion, a little bit better, is ts-expect-error here. That does the same thing. It says ignore the error on the next line, just don't do any type checking on the next line. But what it will do is it will type check it to find out whether there actually is an error on that line. And if there isn't an error on that line, it will give you a nice hint saying this directive is now unused. So since there isn't an error with this line and it's type checking, it tells us we can remove this comment. So that one's a little more handy in cleaning up your code. As it's worth noting, all of these should be pretty temporary. You should at some point be able to get back to all of these comments and try and fix the underlying type error in that file or with that specific line if you used the ignore ones. So now that we've got our server.js and if we run the compiler and it's not showing any errors, let's go ahead and now migrate this to TypeScript by changing this to .ts. And now, as I said earlier, you'll see my IDE in VS Code here is reporting now 2 errors with this file that it wasn't reporting before. The same thing's going to happen if I run the TypeScript compiler here. It's saying result now is of type unknown. As I said before, when we're loading in data from external APIs, which I'm doing in this code, we couldn't define a structure for this data in JavaScript. But now that we're using TypeScript, it can actually do some more stricter checking on that loading in of the data. So we need to give it some structures. Now I'm going to go ahead and add that in now and quickly go over it, but I'm not going to explain the TypeScript code necessarily itself as this isn't a TypeScript tutorial. But let me just go ahead and fix that and then I'll quickly show you what I've done and some other steps. So there we go. I've gone ahead and I've added the TypeScript in here to fix the type error. And you'll see that with this type currency here, type rates, type exchange rate results. And what I've done on my functions as well is I've told it the data structure that it's going to be returning. You can actually look in the blog post for this code here if you were following along with the example project. But as I said, because this isn't a TypeScript tutorial, I was just going to skip over that. But another important thing to note is obviously now we're using TypeScript here. So we go ahead and we compile this. What you'll notice is this is let's say it's line 9. If we go now to our server.js, you'll see line 9 is completely different because obviously when the TypeScript compiler runs, it has to remove all of that TypeScript from it to make it valid JavaScript. But this may confuse some debuggers, so we do have an option to fix that. Say you're using the VS Code debugger or something like that. If you go into your tsconfig.json, what you're going to want to do is add source map, and then you'll want to change this to true here. What that will do is if we do npx tsc, you'll notice it will add some .map files at the end of the JavaScript one here, and it will create some new ones. As I said, what this is essentially telling your debugger is, say we have a line in here, the first line, const directory name here, say there was an error with this line of code. Obviously, the JavaScript and the Node server itself is simply running this JavaScript file, so that line there is actually on line 8. So what that map file does is essentially it just tells the debugger that line 8 in here relates to line 27 in here. So it makes it really nice and easy to start debugging your applications. But there we go. We've essentially fixed our TypeScript issues there, and we've migrated a project over to TypeScript. So what we can do in our tsconfig here is we can remove this allow.js in there. So now that we have everything migrated over to TypeScript, we don't want any more JavaScript files to be able to be created, and it should throw an error if it finds any. But now another cool thing I want to show you is a development step where we can actually skip this compiler step while we're developing and have it constantly run and update as we're making changes. We're going to be doing that using a tool called TSX, which is TypeScript execute. So if you go into here and you do npm install, you can actually install this globally as well. Say if you want to run some TypeScript files ad hoc around your computer, but we're going to install this as a dev dependency as we have before with a couple of other ones. But that's simply just going to be TSX there. So once that's installed, you can actually go ahead and start running your TypeScript files now just using the tsx command line. So what you do is you do npx tsx, and then again, instead of our dist folder now, we can actually just run our TypeScript directly. So we can do source/example.ts, and you'll see that it will print out hello James there. It's actually gone and executed our TypeScript file there. The option we have with this is now we have TSX set up, we can actually change this into watch mode. So you change the command here to tsx space watch and then the file that you want to run. And then if you press enter, it will leave your command line open. And if we come into our example.tsx here, and I change this back to hello world and then save the file, for example, what you'll notice is it refreshes and it reruns and re-executes our TypeScript there. Now the same issue is going to occur if you get a type error in here. It's still going to run and actually execute that JavaScript there. What you'll see is it's printing out that type error. So how can we get the terminal to be also logging out some TypeScript errors? Obviously, you don't necessarily have to do this step because your IDE should be pointing out errors, but you can also come into here, you can do npx tsc, so you come into a new terminal window, and then you do -- watch like so, and then you can also do -- no emit. What this does is it just makes sure that when you're saving changes to a file, it doesn't actually keep recreating these dist files. So that's the no emit option. What this is going to do is it essentially just runs type checking every time you save a file in your TypeScript project. So if I now change this back to world and I go ahead and save this, what you'll notice is the tsc command line here refreshes and it says there's no errors in my file. And then if I go back to that tsx one, you'll see that it's refreshed and rerun our script and it now says hello world. So this is a really good time to change sort of all of your build scripts to use that. Now, as I said, I was using NodeMon before, but I can actually change this to run TSX. So if I change this to TSX, I can now use the source folder instead of the dist folder in development here, and I can change this to server.ts. Now, it's important to note, you probably don't want to use TSX in a production environment. If you're in a production environment, you want to be running this TypeScript compiler and then running the Node script itself and the JavaScript stuff itself using Node. But now that we've got this dev environment set up, I can do npm run dev, and hopefully that should start up our server and our website will be working. So there we go. It says the exchange rate cache is updated. So our script is running. And as I said, we're actually running the TypeScript here using that TypeScript execute. And again, you're going to want to change this to watch mode to make sure that it's updating every time we make changes. So again, if I change that to npm run dev, now if I go and make some changes to my server.ts file, it will actually start updating those as well. So say I change this to public 1, that might cause an error, but there you go. You see that it updates and it redoes all of our scripts for any changes we make. And again, the same thing you can do for the TypeScript code in watch mode. You can get it to show you those errors as you're going. With this setup, you get immediate feedback then when you type errors occur, but it doesn't affect your development velocity since the program continues to compile and it shows you it running. So there we go. You should now have a working TypeScript Node project and you can develop with the safety and ease of TypeScript. I'll leave a link in the description to a blog post on our site that goes over all of this as well, and you can check out some more great how-tos on there as well. If you're setting up a Node project, why not check out our guide on logging in Node.js with Winston, or watch this video here that YouTube thinks you'll like. Thank you very much for watching.